Duncan Sandlin. I thank you for joining me today. We're going to do something a little special today. I came across a Patrick Bet-David video where he explains taxes to us. This is the start of the video. I have not seen this video yet, but we're going to go through it, and I have some guesses as to what I think is going to happen in this. So for those of you who don't know, Patrick Bet-David is seen here. He has a show called The Patrick Bet-David Show. Now, he was... I think he went to college for like nutrition, dropped out, ended up working at Morgan Stanley for a little, like a year. Then he was in insurance, as a financial advisor, selling insurance products mostly, and then started his own little insurance company that grew to be fairly big. It was called People Helping People. It was a multi-level marketing thing, which is more commonly known as a pyramid scheme. And then he eventually, that did well, and he sold that off to somebody for like $200 million or something like that, something ridiculous. He took that money, started his own podcast, Patrick Bet-David Show, and his own little company where they sell like gold and other crap financial products called Valuetainment. So he decided, this is just a casual sort of the rich guy thinking he needs to explain these things to us kind of situation. So you can either go with the rich guy or the professor, it's up to you. But that's what's going on. So here he is, he's going to do the untold history of taxes and war in America. I haven't seen it, but we'll watch it together. We'll start the opening and then we'll see. I'm going to make some guesses.
You know, most of the time when we hear about taxes, we hear about Democrats raise taxes, Republicans lower. You know, most of the time when we hear about taxes, we hear about Democrats raise taxes, Republicans lower taxes. But when you study the history of taxes in the U.S., there's going to be many things today we're going to say, you got to be kidding me, Pat. Who came up with the IRS? You're going to be blown away by who came up with the IRS. The whole idea of holding your taxes.
Yeah, well, okay. So I guess we'll dive in. I actually did a lecture on this years ago. I didn't do the war on taxes, just taxes. Taxes historically a lot of it was a function of war, but you know that's changed over the years. I actually did a lecture on this a while ago, and years ago, and I think when I pulled it up, so we'll compare me to him. Here's what I'm gonna guess though. He's a rich guy. He's a conservative. My guess is these things are gonna happen in this video. That he's gonna argue mainly to lower taxes on the rich. That's gonna be the main thrust of this. That's my guess. But here are my guesses. We'll go through them. Usually when they argue this, they argue for what's called a regressive tax. I'll cover that in a second. Or a flat tax. Basically, they argue that the poor need to be paying more. It's just a different way of arguing it. They'll argue that income taxes are unjust because income taxes tend to tax the rich more on the way they're structured. They'll argue that the rich pay more in tax, dollar amount wise, which is true, but percentage wise isn't true. They pay less. They'll ignore the impacts of recession on taxes and government spending. I bet you he's going to ignore the Industrial Revolution because he mentions war. And historically speaking, you would raise taxes during times of war to pay for things like that, or mass recessions, or major infrastructure projects, things like that. But usually war was the big catalyst for huge taxes. But that changed in the Industrial Revolution. And after the Industrial Revolution up to today. So I'm sure he's going to ignore the impact of the Industrial Revolution on society and why that changed. He's going to misrepresent increases on taxing the rich as rate cuts. This happens a lot. So you'll hear like, oh, this person or that person cut the rates, the tax rates. All right, they lowered the taxes and generated more tax revenue for the government. And it's interesting to me because that's sort of true and sort of not. So oftentimes what happens is you'll see a rate cut where they'll lower the rate, but what they'll do in order to raise revenue is they'll expand the tax base. And what that means is I'm going to limit the number of deductions rich people can take. So I'll do kind of a little bit of a gift here on both sides. I'll cut your rates a little bit because I'm going to expand the amount of taxable income you have as a wealthy person. But while I'm doing that, I'm going to lower the amount of rates that lower income people take. So I'm really taxing the rich more. I'm just trying to make it more palatable. That's a very common thing, but I'm sure he'll misrepresent that because I've seen that misrepresented many, many times. And the few times I've given this lecture, people have always made that argument that, oh, they cut rates and revenue went up. Yeah, but they actually expanded the amount of money you had to pay tax on if you were wealthier. So that's a little different thing there. The last what I'll say is he's going to ignore the effects of government spending on recessions, especially in the 21st century. Because we have learned that government can buy our way out of a recession. And I'll show you that in a little bit. But let's go ahead and let's see where he goes. And we'll go through his videos, so this should be fun. Hang on. 1 second, guys. All right. Here we go.
When you get paid in your payroll, who came up with that idea? Which president raised the national debt the most? Which president raised the percentage and dollar amount? Then we're going to talk about the correlation between war and taxes and why does the U.S. have so many military bases around the world compared to Russia, China, France. All of that stuff we're covering in today's episode. All right, so stick around till the very end because I want to have my final thoughts on a PDF for you. But let's get right into it. 1754 to 1763. During that time, the French-Indian War took place, which the Brits started taxing the colonists. And the colonists said, wait a minute, why are you raising taxes without asking us? How come we don't have any kind of representation? That led to taxation without representation. American Revolution began, and the founders wanted lower taxes and representation, which led to 1775 to...
Wow, that's a little tough. Okay, so the French and Indian War was 1754 to 63. See, so Britain had a huge national debt from the cost of that war. Now, they had already gone through a bit of a recession in England, so they didn't want to create more turmoil there at home. So they just figured, well, it was in America, we'll just tax the colonists. So they really jacked up taxes to fund what was, their deficit from the war. The whole idea between taxation without representation is this came kind of from the liberal movement with John Locke and whatnot, which our Constitution is based on. And the idea is, well, wait a minute, why am I paying taxes if I'm not being represented in the government, right? If I don't have a representative there, why am I paying into this? The British argued this whole thing about what they called virtual representation, which means, well, even though technically you don't have a representation, a representative representing you, well, technically we are, even though you didn't elect us, we just appointed ourselves. So the whole no taxation without representation was to say, no, we're going to pay taxes, we want representation. A lot of it, though, came down to this. The British controlled a lot of the tariffs and how things were controlled with taxation, so it strangled a lot of U.S. businesses and their growth in favor of British businesses. So it was hard to expand business. So a lot of the Revolutionary War was centered around a lot of wealthier sort of landowners and businessmen in America going, we're tired of having to pay all this to the English and, basically having to also give up a lot of our business to them because they're strangling us out with price. So that was a big catalyst. So some of this was just greed. Some of it was, getting away from that sort of monarchical system and moving towards a more democratic system of government. But there were a number of things playing here. So just as simple, he simplified it. I'm just giving you a little bit of context because he missed it.
1783, the American Revolutionary War. By the time it was done, obviously U.S. became a country, and U.S. had two forms of taxes, tariffs and excise taxes. So that led to the tariff.
Okay. Then this is a good point to get into what are taxes. Tariffs are an excise tax. They fall into what are called consumption taxes. So let me do this real quick, and we'll go into this. So, all right, so just some different types of taxes, okay? Taxes generally get put into three general categories. It's either a regressive tax, right? In which case that means lower income people pay more of the taxes, or less wealthy people, right? Pay more taxes than the wealthy. This is, traditionally in the medieval period up through the Renaissance, this was typically how it was done. Progressive tax, usually in the form of an income tax, higher income people pay a higher percentage, or higher wealthier people pay more of a percentage of their wealth or income than the lower classes. And that's how a progressive tax system works. Now, some people argue that a flat tax, everybody pays the same rate, it's equal, but what it ends up being is regressive because a lot of wealthy people don't just make their money through income, they'll make it through multiple different means that aren't taxed. right? Like interest rates or dividends or stocks or things like that, things that aren't taxed the same. So and the way it ends up is that a flat tax, lower income people pay that rate, and higher income people only pay a small portion of their income on that rate. So it ends up being regression. And then it is a function of war and recession on government spending traditionally. So what he's talking about when he goes to this whole deal about tariffs and excise tax. Excise tax is a sales tax. Tariff is a type of excise tax on business mostly. So it is a tariff is I charge you the tariff as the business owner for importing goods. So if I buy goods from Europe and have them shipped here, right, the European person that sold me the goods doesn't pay the tax. I pay the tax. Why? Because my government can't tax a foreign entity. They can only tax me as the business person in the United States. So once I collect the goods, I pay the tariff. And then, of course, I pass that cost down to my consumer. Right, so it ends up being a sales tax in the business. So when he talks about tariffs and excise taxes, you can separate them, sure, but they're both the same thing. An excise tax would also just be a sales tax on purchasing local goods. Usually like alcohol, cigarettes would be like a sin tax, tobacco, cigarettes already covered, cotton, things like that. So sales taxes, excise taxes. Excise taxes are, if you go back to my list here, regressive at the very top. Sales, excise tax, sin tax, just consumption taxes in general. Those are regressive. Lower income people pay the bulk of that. Because every time you go to the store, you pay it. But a wealthy person pays a smaller portion of their income to get those goods than a poor person does. That's just a fact. So, just to give you that kind of perspective for it real quick. So we'll get back into Patrick here and see where he's going.
Act of 1789, which was a 50-cent tax on foreign ships per ton, and it was 6-cent tax on American-owned vessels per ton. Okay, so that's 1789. Then we go to 1792 to 1802, which was the French Revolutionary War, and this introduced us to property taxes. And then in 1812 to 1815, it was the War of 1812. U.S. declared war against the Brits because the negotiation was going nowhere, so Madison wasn't happy about it. And by the way, the whole story about Star Spangled Banner comes from the War of 1812. So now it's when the juicy stuff begins. So in 1861 to 1865, Civil War breaks out in America, right? It wasn't pretty, it was ugly.
Okay, so he's skipped a lot there. Here's the thing. During that time period, that first 50 years, you have to understand there was the British blockade. We were under mass recession for most of the first 50 years of this country's founding. The War of 1812 was a big issue. I mean, we were underwater consistently. So, yeah, when he talks about part of the Tariff Act, that was 50 cents per ship. That was a lot of money back then. So we were blockaded, so anything we could do to raise tax for the government, right? So they basically gouged out the business owners with the tariffs. So the way they figured it was, we'll gouge them out that way. The business owners will have to pay more. Now, in that scenario, it was difficult because the business owners ended up eating most of that money, right, for shipping and moving goods, because they couldn't raise the prices too much because there was a recession. Nobody had any money. There were lots and lots of recessions during that first 50 years. So there's a lot of context there to what's going on. But he's skipping forward, the better part of 80 years to the Civil War. So we'll jump there.
Very expensive. That's when in 1862, a president known as one of the greatest presidents of all time, if not the greatest president of all time, Lincoln, came up with the Revenue Act of 1862, which lasted for 10 years. And in 1862 was the first ever progressive tax, 3% on...
It was not the first progressive tax. It was the first one in this country. Progressive taxes, income tax, have been around for thousands of years.
Income earners between $600 to $10,000 a year, 5% on those making $10,000 or more. Only about 10% of Americans pay taxes. Abraham Lincoln, known as one of the greatest presidents of all time, I have him in one of my paintings in my office. On July 1st, 1862. You know what he started? You know what he introduced to us? An organization you may have heard of before called the IRS. Yes, the IRS was started under Lincoln in 1862 with the idea of having the tax withholding system, which means you make $1,000 in a month. They wanted the employer to withhold the taxes to pay to the government. Why? Because Lincoln said, folks, we just had the Civil War. very costly, very expensive. We got to pay this off. We need you to agree to pay some federal income taxes. But when we pay it off, we're going to get away with this. So guess what happened? Started in 1862. Do you think the federal income tax ever went away? It did. 10 years later, 1872, they said we paid off the war. Guess what? No more taxes. They went away with taxes and went back to what it used to be before. In 1894.
Okay, that's not entirely true. So initially what happened was, in 1862, there was a couple things going on. The Civil War, yeah, they needed the money to pay for it, but two, they just got out of a massive recession that cost, they racked up $400 million in debt, which was a ton of money back then. And the Union was in deep trouble, so they introduced this income tax. They've been talking about doing it for years. You have to remember, at that time, Lincoln and the Republican Party was the very progressive party. They were the very liberal party. That's why they were the anti-slavery party. They were the pro-progressive tax party. Because previously, lower-income people paid the bulk of the tax. Except for in times of war, then you had to tax the rich. Was that right? Probably not. But that's the way they did it back then. So when they passed this income tax law to deal with some of the Civil War stuff, the idea was this thing would be basically would end automatically in 1866, 4 years later. It didn't, because it was so popular and the war was still going. They kept it going until they finally repealed it in 1872. Now, it paid for a quarter of the war revenue, and it paid down 20% of the national debt, or 17% total. But the Revenue Act of 1861, passed in 62, here's the thing. And he said only about 10% of Americans paid tax. It's probably less than that, because back then, it was 3% on incomes over, was it $600, right? Let me see. Yeah, so that would have been, in today's dollars, around $235,000 a year. So in America today, that's the top 1.5%. Back then, it would have been probably the top 5 or 6. 5% on incomes over $10,000 a year, which would today be about $3.9 or $4 million a year. So only the really wealthy paid for this. So this was a progressive tax, taxing the rich to pay for the recession and the war. Didn't tax the poor. And it was popular because it paid down the national debt quite a bit. And it was really helped to balance the budget and create surplus. It was repealed later on because the rich fought it, and there was a Supreme Court case that came out later on that basically said it's unconstitutional. We'll see if he gets into that.
For Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Company, 1895, Congress tried to impose a 2% tax on earnings in excess of $4,000. In 1894, tax was challenged in court by a Massachusetts resident named Charles Pollock. The Supreme Court ruled in his favor, striking down the tax because you cannot go out there and tax anybody for no reason.
That's not why they struck it down. Pollock, extremely wealthy. 2% tax on excess earnings over $4,000. We already explained that would be a multimillionaire today. Multimillionaire. Right? Pollock was a very rich guy. He fought this. Now, this was the ground. This was the argument. If you go into the Constitution in Article 1, and it lays out the House of Representatives, it states the states collect taxes. And then they pay the federal government. The federal government didn't collect taxes. And there was nothing specifying that in the Constitution. So they said, hey, it's not constitutional that the feds can collect taxes. There's nothing in there specifying. That was the issue. That got later remedied by the 16th Amendment. But at the time, the feds couldn't collect taxes, according to the Supreme Court. And that's what he fought. He didn't say you couldn't just tax people for no reason. You couldn't just tax people, blah, blah, blah. There was a reason to tax people, to earn revenue for the government so it can pay for things. There's always a reason to tax. The question is how much? So it wasn't, he's oversimplified that quite a bit. He's taken a lot of this out of context, I think. He's trying to rush through it,
the
too.
Socialist Union Party, the Populist Party, and the Democratic Party sat there and says, we got to figure something out to be able to tax people. What is this all about? So in 1913, we came out with the 16th Amendment, and here's how it reads. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived without appointment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration.
Yeah.
So that's how the first permanent income was levied in 1913, influenced by the Socialist Labor Party, the Populist Party, and the Democratic Party. It was
No. That's a pretty good spread there. The Socialist Labor Party, the Populist Party, and the Democratic Party, very different. The Democratic Party and the Populist Party were very conservative, extremely conservative. And I don't know that he's mentioned this. I don't think he's going. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. Well, a lot of what was going on in 1913 was World War I and a massive recession, worldwide recession. And the government was broke, and they needed money to fund the military, to fund things. And this was not just Congress passed this. This was the 16th Amendment. To get an amendment passed, you have to have a majority, not just a majority, a plurality. You have to have like whatever it is, 2/3 in the House and Senate, and it has to be ratified by the majority of the states. So everybody was in agreement on this, that we needed to do this to raise money. This was not like this was a controversial thing. There was probably some arguments, but it wasn't all that controversial. It passed pretty quick for passing an amendment.
1% for those earning between $0 to $20,000, 2% for those 20 to 50, 3% for 50 to 75, 4% for 75 to 100, 5% for 100 to 250, 6% for 250 to half a mil, and then 7% for 500,000 plus. So keep this in mind. So far we have the French and Indian War, we have the American Revolutionary War, we have the French Revolutionary War, we have the War of 1812, we have the Civil War, and then that leads to World War I, 1914 to 1918, which U.S. got involved April 2nd, 1917. Why does this matter? Because if you go back and look at the taxes, in 1916, the top...
We officially got involved. We were involved in other military skirmishes that preceded that. It just didn't happen overnight.
Top line taxes was 15%. The moment we got involved in 1917, taxes went up to 67%. So that was another reason why taxes went up. Again, war. So
Okay.
then that goes...
The top marginal rate went up to 67%, not the rates for everybody. That was just the rich people, the ultra rich paid the 67%. Let me see if I have this. Let me do this. Here we go. Historical income tax rates. Let me zoom that a little bit so everybody can see it. Come on, baby. Okay, so here we go. 1919, let's go down. Here we go. 1917. So, for people making over $0, 2% was the minimum. Taxes, for people making over $2,000 a year, that would have been 4%. Just to give a quick estimate on that, $2,000, and that's let's do this. That would have been people making, would have probably today roughly be about 80 grand. We're paying 4%, 7, blah, blah, blah. And you see it progressively went up, and up. Unless till you got to 67% for people making over $200,000 a year in 1917. So $200,000 in 1917, and I'm just going to factor inflation and not anything else here. So we'll just do that. You're looking at equivalent today. That would be people making $7.67 million or more. So when he sits there and goes, okay, they raised it to 67%. Yeah, only on the wealthiest of Americans. The most people were paying under 2, or 2 or 3, or 4, whatever it was. They weren't paying more than a couple percentage points. So, once again, they raised taxes on the rich to pay for the war. That's what he's skipping. He's skipping a lot of that. Why did they raise taxes on the rich to pay for the war? Because the rich had money. The poor didn't. The average people don't. That's the problem. The other big problem that was going on up in the 1910s was massive income inequality, and then that spread even worse in the 20s, which led to the Great Depression, which I'm sure he'll get into in a second here. But we'll see where he goes with all that.
Goes to 1929 to 1933. Great Depression takes place. FDR's the president. And in 1933, FDR's New Deal is being launched, and there's two plans to it. Part one of the deal included the Banking Act of 1933 and the Securities Act of 1933. And part two of it was in 1935, which introduced Social Security, minimum wage, Fair Labor Standard Act, and by 1936, the top tax rate hit 79%, and the economy's output plummeted. What we still...
Whoa. That's deceptive. In 1936, the top tax rate hit 79%. Once again, only on the ultra wealthy. And the economy output plummeted. Why would the economy's output plummet in 1936 in the middle of the Great Depression? Because we were in the middle of a depression and it was trying to get us out. And what did he do? He taxed the rich to pay for these social programs to help try and get us out of the recession. That's the point he's missing. Every time there's been a problem, it's because there's been a wealth disparity. You've had a massive recession or a war or something like that. Usually war is a result of recession. Not always, but often. And what did you do? You had to go, well, shit, we had to raise money to solve this problem. Who has the money? Oh, the rich people do. So we got to tax the rich to get the money. We're not talking about 79% for the lower income people, just the ultra rich. Just the what would be today multimillionaires. People like him. That's what he's pissed about. That's my guess, anyway.
But plummeted. What we still haven't covered is World War II from 1939 to 1945, which the U.S. got involved on December 7th, 1941. So combine the Great Depression and World War II led to, in 1945, when FDR died, the top marginal tax rate hit 94%.
Okay. I want to clarify this. Once again, top marginal tax rate. That's what the rich people were paying. We go back and look at this, because I think this is where this gets so convoluted by these guys. Let's do this. So, was it 19? Let's see if I can look this up. All right. 1946. 0 to $2,000 a year. You paid 20% in tax. It's pretty high, but there were a lot of deductions for that. Over 2,000, you're paying 22. Over 4, right? Who's paying the 90? 91%. People making over 200,000 a year. So just once again, the ultra rich, the multimillionaires. All these people are paying over 60, 50, 60 multimillionaires. Okay? The other thing about that is this became fairly common practice all the way up through the 70s to keep it up above around 67 to 70%, up in the 90s. And the rich people paid more to fund all these things and these programs. And what other programs did we fund? Social Security, the minimum wage, the Fair Labor Act, which helped increase the amount of wealth people were making after the war. What did we do? We gave in Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Sallie Mae, people getting home loans, educations. All these different programs built the middle class, built it from federally funded programs. This is what he's also ignored. We are post-industrial revolution now. We are in the middle of the peak of this, of industry. You have to have government to regulate these things and regulate the jobs. That's part of what led to the Great Depression, is there wasn't any government function to regulate that. And what happened was, what led to the Great Depression, and Black Tuesday, and what was it, October 29, when the market collapsed, part of why that market collapsed is income inequality was so dramatic, because there was no tax system to regulate that. So you had workers working 7 days a week for nothing. Output was skyrocketing. These guys were producing more product than ever, right? Making a ton of money, except for they weren't making money because they couldn't sell these products. So now supply has exceeded demand. Well, why did supply exceed demand? Well, A, we're making more, and B, oh yeah, all the workers are dirt poor because we're paying them crap and working them slave hours. So nobody can afford our products. That's why the government stepped in. That was what drove that factor. And the government had to step in and go, no, we got to regulate this. We got to regulate how you can run stocks, how you can do investments, how banks can manage this, how factories can and cannot treat their workers or employers just in general, how much you have to pay your workers at the very minimum. We got to make sure that there's Social Security. Why? Because we have so many people that can't save or couldn't save or don't know how to do it or didn't have family, whatnot. We have a huge elderly population that's homeless that can't get jobs. Either because they're physically unable to work or they just nobody's going to hire them because I can hire somebody else who's younger for cheaper and run them to death. A lot of exploitation and a lot of misery during this time period. The Great Depression and World War II. That's why the taxes were this way. The government had to build up the income and the credit to be able to take care of these problems. That's what was going on. That's what drove this. It's not like this was just a poof appeared out of nowhere. There were things happening that drove this, which is why you had the socialists, the very conservative Democratic Party, and the Populist Party all on board. That's why everybody was on board with this, because there were massive problems and they knew it.
1940 to 1963, the top marginal tax rate hovered between 81 to 91%. That's for 24 years, 81 to 91%. By the way, just some fun facts for you. In 1939, 4 million Americans filed taxes. They raised $900 million of tax revenue. By 1943, 41 million people filed taxes for $13 billion of tax revenue. And 2 years later, 43 million people filed taxes, and the government's revenue went to $45 billion. Cool. So remember how in 1862, Lincoln comes out with the IRS and says, listen, we need to raise money, we need to raise taxes because of Civil War was so expensive that it led to them coming up with the tax withholding system, which means the employer is about to pay the employee $1,000 that you say, they withhold the taxes and they send to the government. Remember that? And then it went away because Lincoln said, when we pay off this debt, this income tax will go away. And then
that's not what Lincoln said. When they passed the bill, the premise of the bill was it would only be temporary to cover the war and the debt. That's not what Lincoln said. That's Congress in the bill. The premise, though, behind that was they thought once we do this, we'll see how it works, and if it works real well, we'll keep it. The problem is that by 1872, the rich people were sitting there complaining because they did extend it another 6 years because it was working so well. What happened was the rich people started complaining and pushed them to repeal it. And at that point, they didn't feel the need that they needed to have that kind of revenue, so they repealed it. And then what happened was when we need it again, once again, we need taxes now because we've got another problem, another massive recession in the early 20th century, and we've got war starting in Europe that we're involved in, which led to the First World War. We didn't know that at the time, but still, we got to start raising revenue. And who has revenue? Who has money that we can tax? It's not the poor. It's not. There was no middle class at this point. It was just rich and poor. So who do we tax? We got to tax the rich. They're the only people with fucking money. That's what's going on. He's making it sound like they promised they wouldn't do this ever again. Well, promised who? The rich people? You? No, that's not what happened. And we're promising we'll never ever do taxes again. We're just going to do it one time. No. Because we're going to do it for now and see what happens. He's spinning this because he's the rich guy. So they're, well, see, they promised we'd never have taxes again. Yeah, I know you'd like to believe that, but that's not the case.
In 1872, it went away. Well, let's come to 1943. The war is still going on, World War II. The party, the socialists, the liberals, the Democrats, went to get help from
the Democrats would have been the conservatives in 43, just so you know.
A guy named Milton Friedman, where in 1943,
he brings Milton Friedman. I will say this, in the 40s, Milton Friedman, libertarian, one of the founders of Libertarian, was a Nobel Prize-winning economist and he won a Nobel Prize for his work in the 40s. Now he's in his early 30s in the 1940s, and what they did was they figured out a tax system, and he had a lot of interesting ideas about supply side economics, which later got misinterpreted and then became, we got like Art Laffer and the Laffer curve, and Milton Friedman worked for Reagan, and these are the guys that pushed trickle down economics. But he pushed this idea of sort of socializing it and moving taxes in and making a system that was more social. Now, what ended up happening is Milton Friedman, extremely racist, very much against the civil rights movement, very pro-segregation, was really upset about how this economic tax system that he developed worked later on and how efficient it was, but it also helped a lot of brown people, which he wasn't happy about. So Milton Friedman, his early work still gets sort of taught, but all the stuff he did later on as a libertarian and with Reagan, all that stuff was basically, we just laughed at it academically. But yeah, that's sort of Milton Friedman in that bag, but ultra racist guy, very pro-segregation, which I think is funny from a Persian guy. I'm sure he's going to defend Milton Friedman because he's a conservative.
He helped the tax withholding system become official, where they can start taking taxes out of your income with the employer sending the money to the government. Essentially, the employer became the tax collector, not the government. And here's what Milton Friedman had to say about this later on in life. This would have been introduced had I been involved or not. At the time, we concentrated single-mindedly on promoting the war effort. We gave next to no consideration to any longer-term consequences. It never occurred to me that at the time I was helping to develop machinery that would make possible a government that I would come to criticize severely as too large, too intrusive, too destructive.
Too large, too inclusive, and too destructive on what things? One, he was against business regulation. He was against the EPA. The EPA was started by Nixon, and it was started because the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio, lit on fire multiple times because of all the pollutants they were dumping into the water. You had lead in paint, causing mental problems, crime rates were spiking. The government stepped in and regulated all this. He was very much against all that. He was very much against the civil rights movement. He was very pro-segregation. And a lot of what happened was with this taxation is everybody's now paying these income taxes, right? They can see them, as opposed to a sales tax where you just sort of pay it. Most people don't think about it. The poor people end up paying most of it. Now these people are involved and they're paying taxes. In an income tax, they're more involved in the system. Part of what then it leads to as a government that now feels like it has to be lobbied and is being lobbied by people, which led to these things that he's all upset about. The machinery that make possible a government that would come to criticize is severely too large, too intrusive, and too destructive of freedom. What he means by that is now they're making us let black people into restaurants. That was just a whole fucking spiel here. So, anyway, crazy stuff.
Of freedom, yet that was precisely what I was doing. Quote, Milton Friedman. So you may be saying, Pat, what's the big deal about this? Who cares?
Well, let me say this, Pat. What Milton Friedman is saying there, in that quote, is he's criticizing the civil rights movement. He's criticizing anti-segregation. He was against non-white people owning businesses, owning homes, marrying outside their race. Patrick Bet-David, married to a white woman, has mixed kids, owns a business, owns his own home. Everything Patrick Bet-David is doing right this second is what Milton Friedman is criticizing by moving towards his economic plans for the war. It allowed these people to contribute and be part of the system, and then when they were part of the system, they started wanting things from the system. That's what he's criticizing, that we shouldn't have even included them. That Patrick Bet-David shouldn't even be included in the system. He should be completely segregated. That's so funny to me. This system he's arguing against is why he has everything he has. It's amazing. Amazing.
Leave him alone. You even got Milton Friedman in your painting. Why are you making such a big deal about this? Here's why. Because when Lincoln did it, he said, when we pay off all the cost.
Lincoln didn't say this. He didn't say this.
That we paid for the Civil War, we will stop income taxes. However, in 1913, when Wilson introduced this, saying when we pay off the bill for World War I, when FDR said, when we pay off the bill for World War II, we will stop taking income taxes.
That's not what they said. That's not what they said. This is bullshit. This is bullshit. They said we'd change it or lower it or whatnot. This was temporary for the war, but they never said we'd stop doing this. No one ever says that.
It never went away. it became permanent. And then the tax withholding system, check, made it very permanent. FYI, you know how old this is? 78 years old.
So once again, I want to get into this because now we're really getting into the meat. Finally, I mean, he's skipped a lot of stuff, taken a lot of shit out of context, but now we're getting into the actual meat here. What did I say? Let's go back and look at it. Argue for regressive tax. Argue income tax is unjust. See, they promised it would only be temporary. So he's already covered these two. Arguing for more for a regressive tax system. He's not arguing against it. He's arguing we should just get rid of income tax and just have it be all regressive tax. Sales tax, excise tax, tariffs. He hasn't argued flat tax. Let's see if he argues rich pay more, ignore impact of... He has ignored all the impacts of recession, so I'm 3 now for 8. Totally ignored the Industrial Revolution, 4. Misrepresented increasing on taxing the rich as a result of rate cuts. I don't that probably Kennedy. He'll do that because Kennedy did a big rate cut that ended up taxing the rich a lot more. We'll see. We'll see where he goes, but we're getting close here. So I'm 4 for 8. I mean, man, I'm good. No, I've seen this enough times. This is not original thinking on my part. This is just I've seen this argument enough times. It's stupid. So we're halfway through. I'm 4 for 8. Well, I'm doing pretty good.
That's it. The whole tax withholding thing with your income when you get your W-2 when you get somebody takes all the taxes out, it's only 78 years old. Why? Because no one said anything about it, and it's now been around for this many years. So here's what's crazy about it.
Well, yeah, but you also have to factor in the results of the Industrial Revolution and the Great Depression, which was, and those recessions, especially the Great Depression, were results of the Industrial Revolution and huge income inequality and abuse of workers. Because people moved from an agrarian system where people were paid a lot in trade or in cash or whatnot, or you kind of just negotiated your own wage, to people were working in factories and you worked for whatever they told you were going to work for. They had a lot more leverage as employers. Yeah, it changed the system quite a bit. That's why he's ignoring that society altered dramatically into an industrial society from a primarily agrarian sort of, barter system to an industrial society where we had to have set prices and ideas and ways to evaluate things. He's missing huge swaths of history. Huge swaths.
Entire time, Democrats keep raising taxes. You got Wilson, you got, FDR here, taxes raised 94.
Remember, the Democrats were conservative, were the conservative party up until civil rights in the 60s under LBJ. Prior to that, the Democrats were a pretty conservative party, and even LBJ, when he signed the civil rights bill, LBJ, extremely racist guy, basically said these N-words will be voting for us forever when he signed it. That's why he signed it. Not because he cared about black people getting rights, but because he thought the Democrats would never lose again if he just signed this bill, because the black people would just vote for him because we gave him civil rights. That's what, none of this is the. I mean, he's making this out to be simpler and more rosy than it is. There's a lot of darkness that follows along with this that he's just skipping right over.
4%, 81%, all this stuff being raised. And then JFK shows up and says, what are we doing? Why do we keep doing this? Why do we keep raising taxes? It is time to lower taxes. And he gives this legendary speech in August of 1962, and here's what he had to say. A creative tax cut, creating more jobs, income, and eventually more revenue. And the right time for that kind of bill now appears in the absence of an economic crisis today, and if the job is to be done in a responsible way, is January 1963. Such a bill will be presented to the Congress for action next year. It will include an across-the-board, top-to-bottom, cut in both corporate and personal income taxes. It will include long-needed tax reforms that logic and equity demand. And it will date that cutting taxes to take effect as of the start of next year, January 1963.
All right, so let me ultra simplify this Kennedy thing for you. Essentially, the problem was the Democrats kept it up, they were kept it high, but there were lots and lots of deductions rich people could take. And that was only on income. It wasn't on wealth. So wealthy people who made their money through investments or interest or loans or things like that didn't really pay much in the way of taxes. there wasn't really much in the way of an estate tax to speak of. So the whole theory behind what Kennedy was doing was, we'll cut rates for everybody, but we'll expand the tax base, the taxable portion of a person's money. That's what he's talking about here. The idea being, and his thought was, it would be, we might see some losses initially on the transition portion of it, but it would generally be revenue neutral. He ended up being wrong. It ended up raising more money for the government for taxing the wealthier. So let's let me see if I have that. Let's see. Here we go. We'll look at this real quick. So this is just an article from Tax Notes. Let's see if I can zoom it in so it's a little bit more visible for you guys. So 63, 64, Democrats embraced growth, investment, and tax cuts in 1964. So long before Congress had finished work on the Revenue Act of 1962, JFK was outlining plans for a second, more ambitious tax reform. Basically, scroll down. So the rate cuts versus the reform. Let me go actually scroll down to this. So the plan. What was Kennedy's plan here? In his State of the Union address right here, and again in his economic report to Congress, Kennedy specifically requested $13.5 billion in rate cuts. He did, including $11 billion for individuals and $2.5 billion for corporations. On the individual side, current rates that change from 20 to 91% could be reduced to a more. So 20 would be the lowest tax bracket, and 91 would be the highest. So progressive tax bracket. Reduced to a more sensible range of 14 to 65. Okay, so big cuts. Big cuts. He said the top corporate rate should be cut from 52 to 47. To help pay for these reductions, Kennedy asked for a selected structural changes to the income tax, including revisions that would broaden the tax base, end unfair or unnecessary preferences, like huge tax deductions, remove or lighten certain hardships for individuals especially, and small businesses, and in the net offset some $3.5 billion of the revenue loss. So if you were rich, this was a tax hike. I'm paying a lower rate, but now a larger chunk of my income is taxable. Just to give you an example, if I make $1 million a year, but only 100,000 of that is income, the other 900,000 is interest or investments or things like that. A lot of that wasn't taxable, so I'm only paying tax on that 100,000. That's the only taxable amount, and I'm paying that tax bracket, which is a lower tax bracket. Right? I'm not in the top tax bracket. I'm probably near it, but I'm not in it. Now, we're going to change that. So later on, what ends up happening? Oh yeah, now the tax bracket's changed. Okay, so I'm paying a lower amount in the bracket I was in. Oh, but wait a minute. We're counting all this other income as other stuff as income that you weren't paying before. So now I'm paying $400,000 or $500,000 is income. So I'm maybe at a lower tax rate, but more of my income is being taxed. So I'm in it paying more as a rich person. As where if I'm a middle class or a lower class person, I'm paying less. So more of my income goes to buying a home, buying a car, taking care of my family, consuming, spending more money, making us a bigger country. That's what we're talking about here. Let me go find it here on this. So let's do 1964. So in 64, they changed a little bit here. Try and zoom in. All right. So bottom percent. Well, this is 68. Let's see. 64. All right, here we go. Bottom percent, 16%, just like we said. He lowered it from 20 to 16. And then it moved all the way to the higher end, highest end paying 77, right? But mostly trying to get it down to around 67 for most people. But still, those people were only ultra wealthy. What would be multimillionaires today, these people paying these higher percentages. The lower incomes were not paying nearly that much. and they got extra deductions for being poor. So that's what we're talking about. So he wants to spin this as, oh, it's a big rate cut, and it was great. So if we lower taxes, it's just great. No, we actually got to raise taxes on the wealthy and got to lower them on the poor and the middle class. That's what's going on. He just wants to spin it the other way because it fits his narrative better. That's why he's missing that they broaden the tax base. He's going to miss that huge portion of that bill.
The billions of dollars this bill will place in the hands of the consumer and our businessmen will both have immediate and permanent benefits to our economy. Every dollar released from taxation that is spent or invested will help create a new job and a new salary. And these new jobs and new salaries can create other jobs and other salaries, and more customers and more growth for an expanding American economy. A Democratic president for tax cuts and for entrepreneurs. Go figure. How confusing is this so far?
No, it's not. It's actually very smart. It makes a lot of sense, and is what Democrats are pushing today. We should cut taxes for small businesses and new businesses. In fact, Kamala Harris is pushing right now this idea that the first $50,000 of profit on a small business that you just started is tax deductible. That makes it a lot easier to start a small business. It takes a huge burden off. Because most small businesses don't make a lot of money in the first 4 years. 70% of them fail within the first couple of years. So this is a huge thing. This is not new to sit there and go, we're going to tax the larger businesses. We'll give them a rate cut, but sure, we're going to expand the amount of stuff that they have to pay on. We're going to reduce their deductions. And by doing that, what we're going to do is we're going to create a system where they're paying a little bit more. The lower businesses that are starting out are going to pay a little bit less, and it's going to be easier for them to be competitive, so we'll have a more competitive system where you'll have more people consuming, which will strengthen the overall economy, as opposed to what we kind of moved towards since the 80s, which is we reduce taxes so much that these corporations are now buying out everybody, and so it's almost impossible to start a competitive business. You're not going to compete with Amazon. You're not going to compete with Microsoft. You're not going to compete with Disney or Nvidia or any of those companies. They're going to just absorb you, right? And then they monopolize and control it. So it's less competitive. You're lowering consumption, lowering wages, more income inequality, because since the 80s when they started lowering this stuff, and hopefully he'll get to that, I don't know, he stops here at 81. He might skip everything from 81 to today, because trickle-down economics that Art Laffer and his hero Milton Friedman push, this whole thing is what created a lot of the income inequality system that we have today, which is part of why we need tax reform today. Which is why you have so many Democrats saying we need to tax the rich more on their wealth and stuff. They could have done what Kennedy. Well, we're going to lower the rates, but we're going to expand the amount of your wealth that we tax. They're not doing that because it doesn't matter. They know that trick now. Kennedy got away with it, but it doesn't work anymore. But he doesn't even know that. He's trying to spin it as, well, no, see, if you do rate cuts, then it's better for business. So if you cut my taxes, it's better for the small business owner that I can then gobble up because I have more money and more affluence. It's backwards. He's not thinking.
Far right. By the way, when he said January 1st, 1963, he gave the speech on August 13 of 62. He died next year, November 22nd. The tax bill went into effect 64 under Lyndon Johnson. And here's what it looked like. He took the top line from 91 to 70%, and he took corporate taxes from 52 to 48%.
But he expanded the tax base, so the amount of taxable income that these companies and these people had increased dramatically. So they ended up paying more taxes. That was the difference.
And this is in 1964 when this came out. 17 years later in 1981, we had the Economic Recovery Tax of 1981 by Ronald Reagan, which this is what Reagan did. Reagan lowered taxes pretty much for everybody. Tax rate, the top line went from 70 to 50, bottom from 14 to 11, capital gains went from 28% to 21. Higher estate tax exemption went from $175,625 to $600,000 in 87. He established the IRA for employees, and this was all helped through Arthur Laffer, the economist. And
Art Laffer is a total joke. Art Laffer came up with what's called the Laffer curve. Now, for those of you who grew up in the 80s, you might have seen a movie called Ferris Bueller's Day Off. There's a scene where Ben Stein is the teacher, and he's really droll, and he's Bueller, and he's taking roll call. After that, the next scene he's in, he's talking about Art Laffer and the Laffer curve. And he's making a joke about how George Bush Sr. called it something economics, voodoo economics. And what it says is at this point on the curve, you're going to create more revenue. So the idea is if we lower taxes on the rich, they'll hire more people, expand more business. And what will happen? The economy will go up and it'll create more revenue because the GDP will be so dramatic. And everybody will make it so much money because it'll all trickle down. And what ended up happening is businesses were like, well, okay, now we've got all this cash, but our markets haven't gone up. Our ability to sell hasn't gone up. There's nothing to spend this money on. So we're just going to do stock buyback and reinvest. Why would we invest money when we're not going to get a return? And what happened? It drove us into a deeper recession in the 80s. And we spent a lot of the 80s in recession under Reagan because of these policies from Art Laffer and Milton Friedman. He's going to ignore that. But if you don't believe me, watch Ben Stein talk about it in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. When he asks, did the Laffer curve, did Laffer work? Did it work? Anyone? 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 It did not work, and it drove us deeper into the recession. Just telling you guys. They made a joke in a John Hughes movie. It was that much of an F up. These tax cuts.
All right. While Reagan came up with this in 1981, in 85, the IRS announced that America has officially produced 400,000 new millionaires due to Reagan's new tax laws.
No, not due to Reagan's tax laws, due to globalization and expansion. On top of that fact, with inflation, a millionaire back then was a big deal, but it wasn't as big of a deal as it was before. It's like saying, by Abraham Lincoln introducing this tax policy, whatever, we created a million new 10,000aires. It's like, okay, back then that was a lot of money, right? Back then, in today's dollars, that's like 40 million. So it's not as impressive. You see what I'm saying? So when they do that, they created millionaires. It's just a number, but remember, money is subject to inflation, so the value of money goes down over time. So I'm saying, this is money, this million is a target. Well, $1 million today is worth a lot more than $1 million 10 years from now. And $1 million today is worth a lot less than $1 million 40 years ago. So part of this too, with this creating the millionaires idea, and this was part of it, is now these people didn't have to pay tax on any of their money, so they got to reinvest it and keep it. So we're talking about just the top percent did really, really well. The top 400,000% or whatever it was, 400,000 people that were in the top percent, right? Those people did really well. He's not talking about the bottom 95%. He's not at all. He's just talking about the rich.
So now I'm going to stop right here because I don't want this thing to be a 30-minute episode. Obviously, after this, we have Bush Sr., we have Clinton, we have Bush, we have Obama.
And, of course, he stops there. Yep. Had to stop there. All right. So we'll get into his sort of final thoughts here in a second. Let's see how I'm doing on the scoreboard here. Let's see. So we got argue for regressive tax. He didn't talk about a flat tax, so I'm off on that one. Argued income taxes are unjust. Well, he didn't say unjust, but he said that they promised they would take them away. We'd never have to pay them again. Hasn't argued the rich pay more yet. I still think he will, though. That's one they love to throw out. Totally ignored the impacts of recession. Totally ignored the Industrial Revolution. Okay. Misrepresented the increase on taxing the rich as rate cuts. Yep, that was with Kennedy. He did that. Ignores the effect of government spending on recession in the 21st century. Okay. That one he just did because he's skipping everything after Reagan. So let's let's talk about why that's important. Because after Reagan, we saw wealth inequality start to increase dramatically, and it has increased ever since. And it's just recently that now wages are starting to beat inflation consistently, mostly under Biden. And this is now becoming a thing where wealth inequality is not dramatically, but it is starting to shrink a little bit for the first time since Reagan. So let's see. Let's see. Here's what I have. So let's look at this real quick. I want to look at this article to show you guys kind of what I'm talking about. Decades of rising economic inequality in the U.S. So this was Economic Policy Institute. Lise Gould wrote this. So just I want to show you a couple charts here that she has. So this shows the real annual average household income by income group from 79 to 2015. Okay? So the top 1%, the richest of the rich, their income since from 79 to 2015, whatever that is, 50 years, 40 years, 45 years, 35 years, sorry, 36 years. Their income, their real annual average household income, just their income, not their wealth, just the amount they make each year, increased by 230%. The bottom 90%, the rest of us, only saw 46% increase over that time. So they got ultra rich, especially after Reagan, when all that stuff really kicked in. But especially under Reagan is when it started, where you see this divide first happen when we cut taxes. Not saying that's the direct result of cutting taxes, but that was a big factor. The majority of income for the vast majority of households come from the labor market. So most people, we make our money from labor, right? Share of household income from wages and wage-related resources, 79. So the bottom 90%, most of our income comes from working. The top 1%, very little of it. Only about a little over a third comes from working for the rich. So they don't work as much. So they're not paying income tax on 3% of their income. They're not paying any income tax on. Just throwing that out there. Productivity. Because of technology and because of education and training, productivity has gone up 246%. But hourly compensation since the 70s, especially under Reagan, where it went down for a while, and it stayed pretty flat. It's gone up 114% since whenever this started, whatever, 1948. But from 79 to 2017, when this ends, hourly compensation, 11%. Right here. Productivity, 70%. 79 to 2017, productivity, 70% increase. Hourly compensation, 11%. So people are working harder for less. Top 0.1%, so the really rich, right? Earnings grew 15 times faster than the bottom 90%. So the bottom 90%, the blue line, way down here at the bottom, that's the bottom 90%. This is our earnings, our real annual earnings growth. 22% in, God, you figure 22% in, what is that? Gosh, that's almost 40 years, 36 years. Let's figure what that is. Let me figure this out on a calculator real quick. That would be, that means our incomes grew by 0.5% a year annually. And inflation averages about 3 to 3.5, depending on the time frame you want to pick. 0.5%, ours grew. So we lost money every year while the rich gained more and more and more money. The top 1% and the top 90% and the top 0.1% in this chart. That's the result. So he ignores all that. He ignores what all these tax cuts did over the last 45 years, 40 years. Depending on how you want to count it. He's ignoring all that completely. So there's that whole factor. What else did I want to show you? Oh, this thing here. So I just want to go through a little brief history. We'll see how he capped it. So the Renaissance, I covered more than he did. The Renaissance in my lecture, so it's just summary. Renaissance, basically the crown, the royalties charged regressive taxes primarily, so public works and mostly for war, and then just the wealth of the nobility. But it was mostly things like excise taxes, tolls, tariffs, things like that. During the Enlightenment period, when the U.S. government formed, the U.S. government charged mostly regressive taxes. Why? Because the government didn't provide a whole lot of services outside of courts and the military and some few infrastructure things. But that brought in the no taxation without representation, the idea of virtual representation and consent of the governed, which we sort of covered. We rejected the idea that you're virtually represented even though you're not really represented, right? You don't have a representative, but since you're paying me, we'll just consider me your representative, was kind of the idea of virtual representation. Then the Industrial Revolution moved more to a progressive tax system, and that's how we've kept the regressive taxes. The states have, especially the government, not so much, but the states. But it's greater needs for public works, greater needs for government spending to create those public works. This includes Eisenhower and the freeway system, electricity, and getting electricity to rural areas, airports, roads, tunnels, bridges, cell phone service, phone service first, then cell phone, internet, computers, just a ton of stuff. Police, fire, trash. I mean, there's a ton of public works that needed to be done to build the infrastructure to make us a world power. And that comes from taxes. You don't have that, then we're not a world power. We're just some podunk third world country without electricity or internet. And you're not watching this video, so you don't know anything about this. Let's see. Here's what I wanted to talk about that he ignored. So the history of U.S. recessions, okay? In the first 50 years, 75 to 1836, there were 12 total recessions. But remember, I had the British blockade, and we were a new nation, so we didn't have a lot of stability. Average time between recessions during that time period was about 2 years. So every 2 years, we were in a recession, and most recessions on average lasted around 2.25 years. So half the time we were in recession, more than half the time in that first 50 years. So over 25 of those first 50 years was recession. So, poverty, misery, lower GDP, nobody could work. It was struggle. So the next, what did I do? 1836 to, this is the wrong, 1938 is what I meant on this one, but oh well. I should have checked this slide. I didn't. It's been a long time since I've seen this. To 1938, there were 24 total. This included the Great. Actually, I did not include the Great Recession in this. So this would have been to 1928. Sorry. This was the free banking era and the start of the Great Depression. So up to the Great Depression. So the average time, and so 24 in that century, roughly. Average time between recessions was about 2.14 years, and the average length of the recession was about 1.7 years. So a little bit better in the length versus the time, but still pretty bad. You're spending about half the time in recession, right? So the first 150 years, that's pretty much what it was. Now, the Great Depression, 1929 to present, there have been 15 total in the last century. The average time between those recessions, though, is 5.1 years. So that's pretty good. And the average length of those recessions is only about a year. So only about a sixth of the time are we in recession. Now, something happened here in the 2000s. We had the recession in 2001, but something happened really interesting in 2008 during the Great Recession, right? Which was the government dumped a ton of money in to bail out the banks and cap the recession. Now, we can argue about whether or not that was how they did it was right or wrong or good, but what happened was this massive government spending. And they did this too during the early recession under Bush. The government dumped a lot of money in to cover the bleeding. Right, so massive government spending. Now, why can the government spend that kind of money? Because it has the they can borrow the money. And well, how can it borrow the money? Because it's backed by the taxing power of the government by income tax. That's why the government can spend that kind of money. And so what we see in the last 24, 25 years, from the 2000s, right, there have been 3 recessions. The average is between 8.7 years apart. So that's a huge improvement. And the average length is 0.78 years or 9 months. So we haven't technically spent a full year, I mean, on average, haven't spent a full year in recession. We did with the Great Recession for a little bit, but the others have been extremely short. And why? Because the government, with its taxing power and ability, has the ability to borrow, because this helps its credit, and because it can do that, it can buy its way out of a recession. So instead of us having to go through a mass recession and suffer, and lots of people lose jobs and homes, and it'd be just absolutely miserable, the government can just throw gobs of cash and public works and different things at it, because they have the credit now to do it, because they have this massive taxing power of the biggest economy in the world. They can buy our way out of these problems. But that comes from the ability to tax. And the best place to tax, if you want to raise money, is to tax the people who have money, which are the rich. And that hasn't changed since Lincoln. So that's what my argument there is. But let's get back into him. Let's see what his final thoughts are, if he's got anything interesting. I think I'm 6 for 8 now. Let's see if I cover the other 2.
We have Trump and then we have Biden today, right? But I want to kind of show you a couple trends I noticed here, a couple things. Number one, a lot of times you'll hear about taxes. You know, rich don't pay taxes, poor pay too much taxes, the rich don't pay any taxes. I wanted to find out who actually pays the most taxes and what has happened over the years. Are the rich paying less taxes or are the rich paying more taxes? And here's what the data tells us. So there's 2 charts I want you to look at. The first one is the percentage of taxpayers. This is directly from the IRS, okay? Percentage of taxpayers. Let's look at the bottom 50%. You can see the majority of the taxpayers is bottom 50%. Then the red is the top 25 to 50%. Then the gray is 5 to 10, the top 1 to 5%. And the black is the top 1%, the richest people, how big of a population there is of the top 1%, right? The next one, directly from the IRS, is the 1%.
Whoa, we're getting to it. We're getting to it, man. It'd be 7 for 8. Let's look at this. What the federal personal income tax share percentage. This is the total amount of dollars raised by the government. All right? So 50% of all the taxpayers are in the bottom 50%. Well, of course. And look, the top 25 to 50% are 25%. So that 25% is 25%. Amazing. 50 equals 50, 25 equals 25, 10 to 25, that's 15. Oh my God, that equals 15. Look at that. That light blue equals 15. 5 to 10 equals 5. It's 5. 5 equals 5. 1 to 5, that equals 4. Yeah, 4, and that 1 equals 1. Great, yeah. Okay, so the bottom 50%, what is their share? Well, their adjusted gross income, we could talk about it some other time. I'm not really worried about that right now. Our adjusted gross income is very small compared to the rich, but the rich also own a lot of stuff. And remember, their income is only just over a third of the working income is only about a third. Their taxable income is only about a third of what they're earning in a year. So you can triple that bar, but their personal share of the total amount of taxes. Well, the top 1% pay a lot more money, total dollar amount, than the bottom 50%. Why is that? They pay so much more than we do, even though it's a progressive tax system, so their rates should be a little higher, but they pay that much more? Really? Really? They pay almost 45% of all the money that the IRS collects comes from those people, and only about, 4%? 3 or 4% comes from the bottom 50? That's weird. Wonder why that is. I don't know. Tell us, Pat. Tell us.
Then the gray is 5 to 10, the top 1 to 5%, and the black is the top or less over the year. If you look at from 1980 to 2018, The top 1% keeps paying more and more and more taxes. So does the top 5%, but the top
More and more of the total amount of money the IRS receives. I want to qualify that. Why is it they're paying more the total amount? I've said it a bunch of times. Because when you tax, you got to tax the people who have money, which is the rich. And what did we see in that other chart? Income inequality is really split. The rich have gotten way richer. And the poor have gotten nowhere, gotten poorer. The middle class has gotten lower. And the wealthy have gotten higher. And so they have all the money. So let's factor this. If I have $1 million this year in income, and I pay 10% tax, I pay $100,000. And you have $10,000 income, and you pay 10%, you paid $1,000. Okay, well, I paid 10 times more than you did. That's not fair. I pay a lot more. Well, I'm paying the same income, the same percentage on my income, right? Well, let's say the following year, because of the way the economic system's worked out, and our taxes are low, I can reinvest a lot of my money. I can make even more money. And I'm still paying my workers that $10,000 a year. Because why? Why would I bother paying them more if I don't have to? If there's no incentive, if there's no tax structure that incentivizes me to do that. Because if I'm paying more in taxes, I'm more inclined to hire more workers so I can deduct them and not pay those taxes. But if I pay less taxes, I'm less inclined to pay more workers and pay them more and make them more efficient. It's a simple equation. It's not that hard. But now, this following year, I made $10 million. And I paid my 10%. So I paid $1 million. But you still made your $10,000. So you only paid $1,000. Well, I just paid way more. You paid nothing, man. That's so freaking unfair. How do you figure that? You're getting screwed because I don't have to pay taxes. That's what's happening. That's what he's arguing. He's arguing he should pay less and get more. And that people that are lower income than him and lower wealth than him should pay more and get less. That's the ultimate end of this argument. And what did I say, man? What did I say? Oh, hang on. There it was, my last guess. Ignore the effects of government spending and recession in the 21st century? Absolutely. So the only thing he hasn't argued is flat tax. So I'm 7 for 8. It's the first time I've seen this video. It wasn't hard. I saw this come. I've seen these arguments so many times, and they're stupid. They totally take it out of context, and they misunderstand how it works.
Top 10% is about the same from 1980 till today. The top 25% is getting smaller. The top 50% is getting smaller, but the bottom 50% is definitely getting smaller and smaller and paying taxes. Now, some of you may be watching this politically, you're on the left and say, wait a minute, what are you saying? The top shouldn't be paying that much taxes? Look, the whole purpose of me doing it this way is to show how much contradiction there is on the left and the right. Why? Because everything about the timeline I showed was what? War, 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 war. Every time we have a war, there.
Up until when? Up until when, Pat? Almost a century ago. Up until when? The effects of the Industrial Revolution. And what was the other factor? Recession. Massive recessions. Since we've instituted tax policy and people have been paying taxes and the government has more power to provide services, we see less recession and less misery. That's the difference. We also see less death and war. Why? Because our military is so immensely powerful. Now, you can argue for or against that. I'm not really here to argue that today. But that's why. He's arguing we go back to a pre-industrial society system where, as I mentioned before in my beginning, the pre-industrial society system, Renaissance, the rich people, the crown, charged regressive taxes on the poor for their own wealth. And during the Enlightenment, when the early government We didn't have the taxation without representation, all that stuff, but the bottom line is we still charged regressive taxes. So the lower wealth people, the lower income people, paid the bulk of the tax. Which goes back to arguing for a regressive tax. He's arguing we go back to that. We only do income tax for war. And he's arguing the income tax is unjust? Yeah, because he's arguing the rich pay more. These arguments are so predictive. They're so predictable. I don't know that we need to watch the rest of it. I mean, it's just the same old shit. I mean, but it's easy to predict. At the end of the day, the summary is just, here's a rich guy who doesn't want to pay taxes, and he's trying to justify why he shouldn't have to. And he thinks that he deserves to get more from the government, from the social contract. He gets most of the benefits as a rich guy. Right? He benefits more from having employees that are educated, having the infrastructure for internet, cell phone, roads, electricity, sewage. He benefits more from the system because he's rich than lower income people do, or lower wealth people do. He benefits. He gets the most social impact. He gets huge tax breaks from the federal government on business and investment. Huge. That you don't get. Part of why he's doing this business. He gets huge tax breaks. So he's getting social benefit. He is a socialist. He just doesn't believe you should get any social benefit. Socialism for me, not for thee. That's the whole argument here. I should be able to be rich and get more and more and more and pay no taxes. And the rest of you, well, that aren't rich, you got to pay all the taxes. And you get less of the benefits. That's it. It's the whole argument. I've seen it a million times, and it's always these 8 or 9 things. These are the 8 that I thought of off the top of my head. But that was that. So that was my video. Thanks for watching, everybody. Hope you enjoyed it. Please like, subscribe, check out other stuff. Usually we don't do long form. We do shorter financial segments where we look at stuff. But I just wanted, I saw this, couldn't resist. Because I knew it was going to be this. It always is. Always, every time. But thanks for watching. We'll catch you next time.